Welcome to another episode of Living with FASD, an informational and human interest show on about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders for those who have it, their loved ones, and by someone who has both professional and living experience with FASD. So this week we are welcoming back to the mic Dr. Jerrod Brown, who always gives us more information than we can handle in one sitting without having to replay it and listen again. So grab your notebooks, prepare to take notes, and know you can circle back and listen again if you need to. So Dr. Brown, thank you for, you're so generous with your time. And I really appreciate that because you are so learned. You know, you spend so much energy on learning everything there is to know about not only fetal alcohol, but any number of different brain-based conditions. And you're so generous in sharing that knowledge. You're not hoarding it to yourself. You're not making people pay for it, but you're willing to share it on shows like mine and Natalie's and Robbie's and wherever else you're sharing. So just thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. That's so kind of you to say that. I'm honored to be back with you.
Yeah, so we have a long list of topics to talk about, and today we're going to be talking about the gut health, the gut-brain connection and why gut health is so important and why we need to pay attention to it. And yeah, why don't first of all, Jerrod, talk about why are you so passionate about this topic?
Because every case that I've consulted on, it seems like, regardless if it's FASD or someone with autism or extensive trauma histories or severe mental health issues, gut health issues are at play.
Mhm.
And it's very, very common in the general population. But when you start looking at it through the lens of like a clinical populations, that number goes way up. And you mentioned in the intro about just focusing on a lot of brain-based topics. And I'm giving more and more talks on this for different groups and taking different angles at this. And if you truly want to understand the brain, I think you have to understand the gut as well. And people are really surprised about that. Why should I learn about the gut, our digestive tract? Because one of the main reasons why people go to their doctors is for gut health issues,
Mhm.
but also for fatigue, sleep issues, and pain related problems. That's what the research literature says as to kind of the big four why people might go to their primary healthcare provider. The reason why I point those out is because each one of those factors can exacerbate gut health issues.
Mhm.
And if someone's dealing with gut health issues, they might have more pain problems or more sleep issues or more daytime fatigue. There's a bi-directional communication that happens in our gut and our brain.
Mhm.
So if one is off, it impacts the other. And specifically to FASD, I've been talking about this for years. I've just seen this in lots of cases I've consulted on. The person complains of digestive health issues.
Mhm.
But now there's starting to be emerging research coming out that's talking about prenatal alcohol exposure and gut health issues might be more common. There's not a lot of studies yet, but you will
Yeah.
find countless studies in the autism world on this that say almost everyone with autism has gut issues.
So talk a little bit about that. What are they saying about having your gut being off and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder?
Well, I really look at it through two lenses. It could be the biological component with the prenatal alcohol exposure, damaging parts of the brain and the
Mhm.
hormones and the way the brain communicates with the gut. But environmentally too, think about trauma. We
Mhm.
unfortunately know so many people with FASD have been impacted by childhood
Yeah.
trauma. And
Yeah.
trauma in and of itself impacts the gut. So if you've
Yeah.
ever studied the adverse childhood experiences literature,
Mhm.
the higher amount of trauma a child was exposed to early on in life, more likely you're going to have gut problems.
Mhm. Mhm.
Also, if you look at this research literature on FASD, unfortunately, a sizable minority of folks with FASD also have maybe some problems with addictive tendencies. Could be drugs, alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, maybe even sugar. All
Mhm.
of those factors impact the gut. Most people with FASD have sleep issues. If you just look at the literature on sleep-related problems and gut health issues, co-occurring
What
factors,
does that show?
there's tons of articles on sleep in general,
Hmm.
but if we're not sleeping, our bodies don't work properly, our inflammation goes up, it throws off our neural hormones.
Okay.
Sometimes, if we're also dealing with trauma, we might be dealing with hormonal dysregulation around ghrelin and leptin. I would recommend your folks just being aware of that topic if you have a strong interest in like eating disorders and
Mm-hmm.
emotional eating problems.
Yeah.
If we're not sleeping properly, we're not repairing our bodies at night, we're running too hard. It's just like
Hmm.
driving a car and you never shut it down, it's going to overheat.
Yeah.
Sleep is number one to health, in my opinion. And we know that so many people with clinical and medical issues and trauma histories also deal with sleep related problems
Yeah.
as well.
I'm glad you brought that up because that is huge,
Oh,
right? If
absolutely.
for our kiddos who happen to have FASD, if they've also happened to have a lot of domestic violence, for instance, or be victims of sexual abuse, particularly nighttime is the time of trauma.
Yeah.
And they've had to learn how to sleep with one eye open, so to speak. So there is no deep restorative sleep. And I think so often we think of the primary role of sleep is that time when short-term memory, everything there gets shuffled over and put in the filing cabinet for long-term memory. But you're right, it's more than that. It is a time of restoration, like winter for trees.
Yeah.
It looks like a time of nothing's happening, but there's so much happening inside that tree. And just with us during that restorative sleep, those deep sleep cycles, you're
There's
right.
hundreds, if not thousands, of biochemical processes going on
Yeah.
while we sleep. And research has found a good handful of years ago now that while we sleep, deep sleep, there's actually like a neural plumbing system in our brain where it helps get rid of the toxic buildup that we've encountered through the day. So it
Yeah.
helps detoxify our bodies. So if
Yeah.
someone's not sleeping
That's
day
huge.
in and day out, we have toxic buildup, and that's been
Hmm.
linked to all kinds of problems, to name a
Okay.
few.
So that would, in essence, interfere with learning and memory?
Sure, you bet.
Okay.
Chronic sleep deprivation in children in general, or even undiagnosed sleep disordered breathing, can mimic symptoms of ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder. And if you treat the underlying sleep issue, a few of those studies say that a lot of those symptoms may go away
Dissipates.
or go down. Now, that's
Yeah.
not FASD specific, but if
Yeah.
you're ever working with a child or even an adult who's had a long history of behavioral problems,
Hmm.
you got nothing to lose by digging into their sleep history because maybe that's a variable. Maybe it's not the
Yeah.
only variable, but if you can help them get better sleep, maybe it
Yeah.
improves their behavior by 20% or 30 or who knows. So
Yeah. So, how is attention to gut health beneficial for sleep?
everything works better when our gut is working better. The reason why I say that is it's the hub of our immunity. People are surprised to learn that the gut is almost like it's the microbiome. That's something you want to be aware of, and that gut brain health connection, the microbiome almost act as its own organ. And in the gut, that's where the majority of our serotonin is produced. People are
Hmm.
surprised to learn that. Depending on what like research study you look at, I've seen anywhere from like 80 to 90% of our serotonin is produced in our gut.
Hmm.
And if you know what serotonin is, you know how much that plays a role in mood.
Yeah.
And if there's abnormalities in serotonin, that can impact energy levels, plays a role in depression.
Hmm.
So if you fix the gut, a strong argument can be made. It plays a huge role in improving your mood state. And
Hmm.
in my opinion, it should be a frontline intervention for anyone dealing with a mental health issue because the research is pretty clear. If someone has a mental health problem, that's an indication that their gut is not working at optimal levels as well. So fix
Okay.
the gut, another targeted intervention for mental health And I encourage mental health providers to become trained in this. And I'm actually giving a talk, I think it's in 2 weeks, to a group of criminal justice professionals, encouraging them to also become gut brain health access informed. Not a lot of research on this yet, but a couple studies now are talking about, does gut disruptions and problems with your gut microbiome maybe play a role in criminal behavior or violent behavior? And could that be another targeted intervention to maybe combat crime? It's not the only factor by any stretch, but I've done enough work in the criminal justice system to also hear stories that so many folks that are coming out of prison also are dealing with a ton of health disparities,
Yeah.
including digestive health problems.
So when you say fix the gut, what do you mean by that?
I'm not giving medical advice here, but talk to your
Right.
healthcare provider.
Yeah.
There's a lot of interventions that folks can try that's all common sense. We talked about sleep,
Mhm.
get sleep under control. If you eat a very poor diet and you're eating fast food constantly and pounding down the energy drinks and sugar sweetened beverages, that's all been linked to gut health issues.
Mhm.
Work with a nutritionist. Social isolation has been linked to more digestive health issues.
That's
Working on,
interesting.
yeah, it's really fascinating. Couple studies have also found that living in like a very crowded housing environment can cause more gut health issues. The reason being, if you're in a crowded housing environment, you're probably getting woken up more, there's more stress.
Mhm.
Looking at your environment, looking at
And,
what you
and and you're
eat,
not getting that deep restorative sleep because of the
absolutely.
sleep interruptions.
Anything that's a threat to your emotional health is probably a threat to your gut health. So an example is, if you're listening to this and you're on your screen 16 hours a day and you don't ever exercise and you just don't ever eat any healthy foods, your
Mhm.
gut's probably not working properly. If you're
Mhm.
going through a very high conflict relationship, you just lost a job, you're dealing with grief and loss issues, that all impacts the gut as well. So
Mhm.
it's all interconnected. That's why I'm such a fan of this research, because it really is a full mind body
Yeah.
perspective and a
Yeah.
holistic approach to
Right.
combating disease and illness and maybe even criminal behavior in
Yeah.
some cases.
Fascinating.
It really, yeah, it is a
Yeah.
fascinating subject.
I was listening to, when you're on social media, it's full of commercials. It's no different than TV anymore. But there was one from a celebrity doctor,
Yeah.
that was very well known. And so as I listened to that, I kept hearing you in my
Okay.
mind. But he was talking about, he was looking at, there's a number of cities around the world, and they're all kind of like within, I don't know how many 100 miles, but around the equator. I think one of them more, there's a couple communities in like Italy or Sicily.
Mhm.
There's down in our Palmdale, no, not Palmdale, um, San Bernardino area, Loma Linda, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's these population centers where there's a lot of people that are 100 years or more.
Yeah.
And looking, and they're all worldwide, and looking at all those and trying to come up with some commonalities. And of course, diet's an area where you're going to look for commonalities, thinking there must be some kind of secret. And he's like, well, um, some of them are vegan, and others of them, tons of, white bread, white rice, cheese, superficially it's all varied.
Yeah.
But what he did find is that they all have very low levels of lectin.
Okay. All right.
So lectin being, for those of you who have not happened to watch this infomercial, um, lectin is actually, foods that are very high in lectin are all your whole wheat products. Because what had grabbed my attention and made me sit down and watch this was, if white rice is so much worse for you than brown rice, right? Why is it that there are vast portions of the world that eat nothing but white rice and yet are healthy? Kind of makes no sense. And that's what got him spinning off in this direction. And I thought it was fascinating. But in the brown whole wheat, in the whole wheat world, um, there's it's high in lectin, and lectin is very sharp. So it's like a diet full of thumbtacks for your colon.
Interesting. Interesting. I've seen similar like documentaries where they've looked at these kind of cities too. And a couple things I've heard is that community is a big role where they're
Hmm.
not isolated and they're constantly on the go. I can't
Hmm.
remember what city it was. It was in another country, but they were constantly walking up hills all the time and the elevation was higher too. And they thought
Hmm.
that the elevation maybe played a role because there was less oxygen higher up
Hmm.
and it created less kind of breakdown in their body. And some of the cars at that higher elevation had less rust on them as well. It was just
Oh, that's interesting.
very fascinating. I haven't heard the
Yeah.
lectin discussion, but yeah, there's so
Yeah.
many like biochemical things at play,
Yeah.
social, family, and neurological factors that kind of probably converge.
Yeah. It was talking about how thin our colon is. You
Leaky
know,
gut, that's another term you'd probably want to be
exactly.
aware of.
It
And
said that lectin is the number one contributor for leaky gut syndrome,
yeah,
where all those toxins that should be flushing out are actually leaking into the abdominal cavity, and poisoning us.
yeah, it's a slow
Yeah.
poison. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yes. And unfortunately, you look around the United States, around the world, it seems like the world is moving in the direction of that Western diet. We know in the US that's very common.
Hmm.
That would be another search term for folks to just be aware of.
Yeah.
And you will find several studies that talk about people who rely on the Western way of eating. That's typically more fast foods, more processed foods, foods that are full of preservatives and
Hmm.
emulsifiers and sugars and salts and all kinds
Yeah.
of things that taste really good and very high in energy,
Yeah.
but typically lack a lot of micronutrients. That way of eating over the long haul
Yeah.
has been linked to so many problems, including digestive health issues. And I don't want to worry your audience. If you go to fast food once in a while,
Yeah.
probably not a big thing to worry about. But if you eat this all the time, every day, over year after year after year, I
Yeah.
mean, look at the research: diabetes, obesity.
Yeah. And it's hard. A challenge also is the reliance upon not fast food per se, but prepackaged foods,
You
right?
bet.
Because I hardly ever eat fast food.
Yeah.
But yeah, do I get a pre-made mac and cheese or lasagna or something like that at Costco's and pop it in the oven and there you go, you got dinner
Yeah.
without all the labor. But that's processed food.
Yeah. And that's part of the Western
Mm.
lifestyle is go, 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 not
Yeah.
having a lot of time, eating on the run. How many
Yeah.
people are listening to this right now who never take a lunch break or
Mm.
eat 2 minutes quickly while working? You forget to have water all day long. You're drinking tons of
Yeah.
coffee in the morning. You're mildly
Yeah.
dehydrated. You're on the screen late into the evening
Yeah.
while multitasking. I mean, all those things can wreak
Yeah.
havoc on the brain and body and gut.
Yeah. And boy, wasn't that a challenge that came to me on a deeply personal level as I was listening to that infomercial. Because you and I have talked about the whole sugar addiction bit. Um, and there's so much involved in that, right? It could be that many of us on the spectrum have a programmed sugar addiction, right? Just from having our source of sugar, because alcohol is metabolized as a sugar. And so if we're bathing in and swimming in sugar for 9 months and all of a sudden that's gone, there are those that propose that creates a sugar addiction just waiting to be triggered. But I have type 1 diabetes. So I don't I try to avoid my sugar addiction, and I will admit in a heartbeat, yeah, I have one. All these years, I thought it was a psychological thing from being told, no, 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 you shouldn't eat that. You'll lose your sight. You'll lose your kidneys. You'll lose your leg, blah, blah, blah. Right. And it's easy to say, oh, yeah, that happens to other people. But it's the reality that it may have a biological basis was like, wow. So I try real hard, to stay away from that kind of stuff. But I do love my sweets. And so I get a lot of the diet foods, right?
Not alone.
Splenda tastes the best, right? I mean, I grew up when I was a little kid, they were doing research on saccharin because sweet and low was the only one there was. And it was like, oh, that'll cause cancer. And then it's like, well, yeah, but you have to, given the size of us compared to the size of the lab rats, you have to have 50 cans of Tab because that was the sugar-free drink back then. Tab. Hope I didn't offend any Tab drinkers out there. God, that was foul. But a person would have to have the equivalent of 50 cans of that a day in order to get a level of saccharin content that would be a carcinogenic. So I didn't worry about it, right? And then Equal came out, or NutraSweet. And then, of course, the research followed. Oh, you shouldn't have that because blah, blah, blah. And I know at one point I had asked you, yeah, what about Splenda? Because it does taste the best, in my humble opinion. And I consume it all the time, right? I don't drink water. I drink Crystal Light. I drink at least 3 liters or 3 quarts a day because I do make sure I'm hydrated. I've got to have a huge thing for each coffee, right? I'm trying to balance my hydration with my caffeine. But I'm listening to this infomercial and it said even one packet will wipe out half of your probiotic balance from your gut. I'm like,
A
okay,
huge thing. Yeah.
maybe when I run out of Crystal Light, we just don't replace it.
I'm
And
not telling anyone what to do, but there's lots and lots of research on how some of those sugar-free substitutes and drinks can wreak havoc on the gut microbiome and increase inflammation. And
yeah,
it's a tough topic, and
yeah,
I get it. I know lots of people that are consuming these kinds of beverages, and
yeah. And isn't it odd? You think because you're avoiding sugar, you should be getting skinnier, and yet your circumference just keeps growing.
as I learn more about like obesity and weight,
Uh-huh.
there's so much more than how many calories you take in and then how many you burn every day. There's so
Yeah.
many biochemical processes, genetic factors, all kinds of things. It's a really fascinating topic. But
So
what I've
there.
seen on cases I've consulted on, I've seen it go both ways
Mhm.
when it's specifically FASD. Some folks have been extremely overweight and others have been extremely underweight. I've seen
Mhm.
it both ways. And there's an unusual relationship that some people with FASD have with food.
Mhm.
There's a lot of reasons for that. Some of it could be impulse control, some of it could be trying to cope with trauma.
Mhm.
What happens if that child grew up in a home and there was food neglect or food insecurity or food
Mhm.
hoarding, and how those
Mhm.
carry on over through the lifespan?
Or how much of it might be the interoception, right? The brain not getting the signal from the stomach that
Yeah.
says we're full.
And that's where that
So you
ghrelin and
keep
leptin
eating.
come in. So
Yeah.
those would be 2 hormones for people to be aware of at the biochemical level that might be going on, that either tell our brain to not stop or
Mhm.
keeps telling us we're hungry and eat and eat and eat and
Yeah.
eat and stuff. So
Yeah. And the next thing you know, we're throwing up because We
Yeah.
physically can't fit anything else in
Yes.
there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And these are things that mystify our parents.
Well, a lot
Right?
of people are never trained in this. I didn't know about this stuff a
Yeah.
good handful of years ago, but once you can learn about it, education is key. Just
Yeah.
knowing the terms. And if you're informed on this, then you're in a better position to maybe increase your health literacy and your nutritional literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And if people truly want to move in that other direction, working with a nutritionist or qualified healthcare professional, motivational interviewing can be helpful. Nudging interventions is another approach that people don't think about. There's a whole line of research literature on nudging interventions. It's not FASD specific, but they do use nudging interventions to help people eat better, quit smoking, make better decisions. And even metacognitive training has been associated with better food choices.
Mm-hmm.
And self compassion literature says people who are more self compassionate may be in a better position to take better care of themselves physically and eat better and exercise more often and have more motivation just to live a healthier lifestyle too.
So when you say metacognitive training, that's thinking about your thinking?
Mm-hmm. And knowing about knowing and
Mm-hmm.
having a good awareness of your strengths, your limitations,
Mm-hmm.
knowing when to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
For people with FASD, that can be tricky at times, but it can be
Yeah.
trained. And there's a couple studies that have been published in the FASD world that do talk about using metacognitive training for people with FASD can be
Mm-hmm.
very helpful. And
Yeah.
so is self-control training. I would look at some of those studies too, teaching people how to pause and reflect and put on the brakes. And that kind of goes along with interoceptive awareness, just teaching
Mm-hmm.
people what's that feeling that you want to be on the lookout for that you're full. It may not be the same feeling that someone else has, but
Mm-hmm.
they may have some red flag indicators, some cues, some things to teach them to be aware of.
Okay.
A lot of interventions to try, but these are just a few things maybe to think about.
So this is just another reason why mindfulness is so important.
I'm a
Right?
big fan of mindfulness, definitely. For some people with FASD who have a really hard time sitting still and staying focused, I suspect mindfulness would be very difficult. But
Mm-hmm.
starting small and training their brain to move in that direction, if you can get them to slow the brain down,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely a wonderful thing. Teaches more patience, delayed gratification.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the marshmallow test. If you're bored one day, go and Google the marshmallow test. It's a classic test in psychology. It just shows the importance of teaching self-control to kids.
Okay.
It's not FASD specific, but it's just a good reminder for like all caregivers to just be aware
So
of that research.
so just to go off on a tangent, what is the marshmallow test?
Basically, they give kids and they have a camera set in there. The kids don't know what's going on. And the researcher comes in and says, here's two marshmallows. If you don't eat this one, or they give one marshmallow, if you don't eat this marshmallow and wait a period of time, you will get a second marshmallow in a little bit. And they just
Okay.
have a camera set up. Some of the kids eat the marshmallow right away and they follow these kids through the lifespan. The kids who eat the marshmallow right away might have some more problems later on in life. It's not as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
And the kids who wait and are able to pause and delay gratification, they follow those kids, and those kids typically do better in school and just are able to be more patient. Again, it's not as simple as that, but
Right. Right.
it's a cute little test. You can find all kinds of videos on YouTube. It's often talked
Yeah.
about in different psychology courses too. And
Okay. So that does speak to delayed. Oh, that was weird. All of a sudden I could hear myself get repeated. Um, that speaks to delayed gratification, right? And being able to connect um, cause and effect, right? If this, then that. And that's something that a lot of folks on the spectrum really, really struggle with.
yes, it's a core
So,
deficit, abstract reasoning deficit's basically what that is.
yeah. So But it's not to say you cannot develop those skills if you don't naturally have them.
Well, I think people can develop, absolutely. It might be more difficult for some
Mm-hmm.
folks, but journaling can be very helpful to help strengthen that. There's
Mm-hmm.
a couple cases I've consulted on where the person with FASD loves journaling, and that has been very, very helpful in helping that person connect the dots. Now, is it going to happen overnight? Probably not.
Yeah.
Patience, kindness, consistency, predictability, structure, repetition.
Mm-hmm.
It can, of course, it can be built. Like, again, it depends on the level of damage done to the brain. I mean, there are
Yeah.
some folks with FASD, unfortunately, who are in a group home and can barely function. I mean, that's going to be obviously a different ballgame than someone with FASD who lives independently and has a job. And but it's
Mm-hmm.
all very individualized. But I do
Mm-hmm.
believe absolutely, I've seen it firsthand that you teach these skills. It can get better. Maybe someday you take one step forward and two steps back, but you just keep pushing ahead.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Year after year, you might see improvement. Day to day, it might be tough to see improvement. But if you look year after year and month after month and stay in the course,
Mm-hmm.
and part of that, in my opinion, and I suspect in the years to come, in the FASD literature, I hope, in my own opinion, that one of the frontline interventions is getting the gut under control and
Mm-hmm.
getting sleep under control. That's talked about quite a bit. Sleep in the FASD literature is talked about frequently.
Yeah.
But getting the gut under control just means the rest of the body's probably going to be working a little bit better.
Okay. So when the gut is out of control, how do you see that? What are some of the ways we see that reflected in how we are functioning cognitively?
Well, this is, I mean, there has been thousands and thousands of studies on the gut in general, but in the FASD literature, very few. But if you look at the gut literature in general, if the gut is off, which is basically gut dysbiosis, something's off with the microbiome, it's been linked with more mood problems,
Mhm.
increases in anxiety and depression. They've done several studies that show that people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis and autism all have something off with the gut. I mean, the
Mhm.
list goes on. If the gut's off, you're more likely to have allergies, autoimmune issues,
Mhm.
irritable bowel syndrome, diabetes. There are several studies that have been published on diabetes and problems with the gut. I mean, you just go to Google
Type 1 or
Scholar.
2?
A lot of it,
Okay.
I know you have type 1. Most of my experiences with type 2. So
Okay.
I don't feel comfortable talking about type 1. You're the expert there, but type 2, lots and lots, because
Yeah.
type 2 obviously is a lot of times related to environmental factors and the
Yeah.
way we eat and stress
Well,
and
it's more of a metabolic issue, right?
yeah,
It's an issue of
absolutely.
metabolism versus autoimmune, because type 1 is autoimmune.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
again, there's so many things that can impact the gut, just our own lifestyle.
Hmm.
If you've ever worked with people who are uptight and rigid and they can't let things go,
Hmm.
that can impact the gut. People who are easygoing, go with the flow, and a little more calm, more resilient, that's all a protective factor against some of these things.
Hmm.
Medication use, certain medications, you will find in this literature that some, like someone who's trained in this will often ask, how often were you on antibiotics growing up as
Hmm.
a kid? That
Yeah.
can play a role there.
Yeah.
Mode
Yeah.
of delivery in terms of, was it a vaginal birth or cesarean section? That's been talked about several times.
Okay.
They have talked about
What
this.
I'm curious, what is the finding there? Are they
Typically, vaginal births, better gut microbiome.
okay?
Cesarean section maybe not as good, but
Okay.
it's not as simple as yes or no. Maternal factors, environmental factors, dietary
Hmm.
factors, lots and lots of stuff. Housing conditions. Again, where you live. They've done studies on urban versus rural environments.
Okay.
They have done studies on pollution exposure and endocrine disruptors. And if someone lives very close to like a factory or freeway, I mean, there's so
Yeah.
many studies on so many things, caffeine and sugar, and just really fascinating. And there's several studies too that talk about this within the context of prenatal and early postnatal life as well.
Mhm.
And even socioeconomic status can impact this. And people that work shift jobs, people that work long, long hours or had histories of malnutrition, all of these things can impact the gut.
Mhm.
Racism, health inequities, marginalization, oppression have all
Mhm.
been studied too in this literature.
That it kind of makes your head spin.
Yeah, I mean,
Where do you start, right?
yeah, I know. I went to a training before COVID and it was on the gut. And the trainer at that time, this is probably 5 years ago now, said that there's like 3 new studies that come out every single day in the world on something to do with the gut. I'm sure
Wow.
that number just keeps growing and growing and growing. I've
I
read thousands of studies on this, and I think it's a drop in the bucket of what's out there.
I wish we could get that kind of research curiosity about FASD.
Yes, that would be very helpful. And this is another variable I think
Yeah,
to really focus on
yeah,
if we have students in the crowd or researchers or
yeah.
doctoral
A call to
dissertation
action.
students. Yeah, this is a huge topic.
Yeah. So out of out I guess I'm curious, what might you still be curious about when it comes to the connections between gut health and FASD? If we were to throw out a call to action to, PhD students out there.
I would love to see what impact this has on older adults
Mhm.
with FASD. There's not a lot of research on older adults in the FASD world. Most of it's with
Yeah,
kids. I mean,
yeah.
not all, of course. My work in the criminal justice forensic arena, I would love to see studies done on this through that forensic and legal lens and how this impacts like a defendant or someone who's in prison or
Mhm.
going through the process who has FASD. Does it impact their decision making at all, or how they present to
Mhm.
the police or the evaluator? What role does that play?
Yeah.
I would also love to learn more about what are the main environmental factors in this population that contribute to this. And it's probably very similar to other research, but what role does their diet play in
Mhm.
combating this?
Mhm.
What do adoptive parents and foster care parents need to know? What would happen if all foster care parents became gut health access informed? Knowing, I mean,
Yeah.
would that change the way we do things? Because
Yeah.
there isn't in the adverse childhood experiences literature, there's one article that always sticks out to me and I always quote. It says, eat more fruits and vegetables if you want to combat adverse childhood experiences.
Hmm.
What role does eating really healthy, nutritious foods, getting the gut under control, play in kids with profound attachment and trauma histories?
Yeah. Yeah.
Would it calm it down? Would it make a difference? I I hope so. I think so, but
Yeah.
it's tough to know.
Yeah. That would be, gosh, there's so much for foster and adoptive parents out there to learn.
Yes.
Just even getting the very basics on how to care for kids who are not your own is an enormous volume of things that people need to know. People with big hearts who, aren't researchers. They're just stepping up to do the right thing for their community. Um, and yet, because this is about FASD, how many of them learn much of anything about FASD?
You know, not much.
Yeah,
Very little. And how
yeah,
much can you truly learn if you take a 1 hour online training as well? I mean,
yeah,
it's good, I mean, but do you remember it in a month?
yeah, yeah.
That's the tricky part.
Well, and if it's part of the pre-training, pre-certification
Yeah.
training package, then I would say you're probably not going to remember much at all, simply because it is sandwiched in there with so much else. And
Absolutely.
when we're flooded with information, there's no way we can actually get it all filed away in
Absolutely.
our long-term memory and be able to access it again.
And for some of these parents that bring in some children, it's survival mode for the
Hmm.
first
Yeah,
several weeks, months. You're not
yeah,
sleeping. Maybe it's a new baby and they're really colicky or
yeah,
reactive attachment disorder. I mean, it's
yeah,
tricky. You're just surviving. You probably don't care to sit down and like study things. And I get
yeah.
that. I mean,
Yeah, and as a foster care social worker, all the time I hear, "Oh, that's what they meant." Right? Something will happen, and all of a sudden they hear their trainer in their head. It's like, "Oh, that's it." Right? So, especially if we're talking about trauma stuff, or, all this stuff that um, that make parenting kiddos in out of home care different from caring for your bio kids. And then add in all the FASD pieces on top of that.
yeah, it's a
There
lot to
there's
ask.
mhm,
But in my opinion, it needs to be done if we're going to
yeah,
effectively support these children and help them
right,
thrive.
right. I mean,
And
we're looking
another,
at 70% of kids in care having an FASD, and 86% of those kids are either not diagnosed or they're misdiagnosed.
yeah, I've seen
You know,
statistics all over the map, but what I can say
yeah.
is it is definitely significantly elevated
Hmm.
in the child welfare, child protection systems
Yeah.
compared to the general population,
Yeah.
without a doubt.
Yeah. And the other piece that concerns me, working in foster care, um, is, the kids age out, right?
Yeah.
They come of age, and unless they're adopted, they don't have those permanent roots, and they're expected to go function. You're 18, but developmentally, they might only be 9. Well,
Yeah.
who in the world is going to tell a 9-year-old, go for it, kiddo?
Not going to happen. And how likely is that person going to be able to hold a job or go to college if they function as a 9-year-old?
Yeah.
You're probably aware of the literature on the aging out of foster care. It is very scary
Yeah.
what health problems some of these kids face.
Yeah.
And aging out of foster care means that they probably didn't have a permanent placement. And
Right.
health disparities, food insecurity, more likely to use drugs, more likely to have asthma, more likely to deal with homelessness and poverty. And even
Right.
that foster care to crime connection, there's a whole line of literature that talks about that.
The school
Not
to
that
prison
some
pipeline.
It's something like that. It's not like
Yeah.
someone is in foster care, they're going to commit crimes,
Right.
but it has a lot to do with the placement, the type of trauma, the
Right.
support they have. But there
Right.
is several studies that look at the foster care to crime relationship
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. And if children who have an unrecognized, unidentified, therefore unsupported FASD,
Yes.
um, they are far more likely to be bounced from home to home to home to home, because nobody is recognizing that their behavior is a cry for help,
Yeah.
because they have there's that continued chronic gap between their ability to meet other people's expectations, and being able to just be met and supported for who they are
Yeah.
and where they are, what their strengths are, what their needs are, instead of assuming that behavior is their choice. You're just not motivated. You could do it if you tried harder. You could do it if you wanted to. Blah 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 blah. So you do see those negative outcomes that internet searches, terrify every parent of a child who gets the FASD diagnosis, and it is more likely if the FASD goes unrecognized.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, and when kids are when young adults are kind of cut loose and adrift, they're not going to have a good diet. They're not going to have stable income. They're not going to have stable anything. So, and that's going to continue to keep the gut off balance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any trauma, any adversity, any conflict can just wreak havoc on the brain and body, toxic stress exposure. And if you're talking about someone that maybe has very poor coping skills, where they struggle with naming and labeling their emotions, they turn to food to cope, they turn to alcohol, drugs, smoking, whatever,
Mhm.
a problematic peer group. I mean, all these things, all that negative energy goes into the body. They don't sleep well, probably, their guts off. So, definitely a call to action to become gut brain health informed. And I'll just throw the question out there. I don't know the answer, but we all talk about becoming trauma informed and attachment informed.
Mhm.
Would it be equally important to become gut health informed? Because if someone's dealing with profound trauma and profound attachment and profound mental health issues, their gut's probably not working.
Yeah.
And if their gut's not working, everything from that can cascade and it impacts their brain and their energy and their mood and their circadian rhythms and their eating habits and their
Mhm.
motivation. And it's all
Mhm.
interconnected.
Yeah. How beautifully complex we are, with or
Very,
without
very much so.
FASD.
Yes, very much so. Yes, yes, yes.
And our time is up already.
Yes.
How
We
did
got
that
to
happen?
5% of what I was hoping to cover.
Oh,
I'm not kidding.
okay.
No, that's
Let
good. That's good. We
let's
covered
do
some good
let's do
ground.
one more piece. Go ahead. Floor is
No, I'm
yours.
saying I think we need to do a part two if you're open to it on this topic because
Of
there's
course.
so much with the gut I was not able to share today because we have such rich discussions and there's
Yeah.
so many moving parts with this.
Yeah.
But it's really changed my paradigm. When I started learning about the gut and where I'm at today, I believe by becoming gut brain health axis informed, I'm in a better position to understand complex human behavior and interaction and even communication patterns in a better
Oh, we
manner.
definitely need to go there.
It's
You
really
just did.
fascinating.
Yeah. You awakened my curiosity big
Yeah,
time with
it's
that one.
really something. So again, the question I'll leave you on this. We don't know how many people with FASD have gut health issues, but
Mhm.
I am aware of one study. I mean, there's numerous studies in the autism literature, but there was one study that was published that says as many as 91% of people on the autism spectrum have gut health issues.
Mm.
How does that equate to people with FASD? Don't know, but we know again we're dealing with a couple issues. We got the prenatal alcohol exposure and then whatever happened to them after birth. And a
Yeah.
lot of times, what happens to folks with FASD after birth, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, is not always pretty.
Yeah.
So, to be honest with you,
Yeah. Wow. This time is over. So hold that thought until you can rejoin me at the mic again.
look forward to it. And I always learn so much from your knowledge and background. I'm honored to be here and I'm glad you're doing this podcast
Oh,
too.
thank you so much. Okay, so for all the viewers or listeners, if you have questions about the gut brain health connection or gut health in general, if you want to see how that might possibly relate to your life or your child's life, your spouse's life, whatever, please feel free to email me at livingwithfasdpodcast@gmail.com. Send me those questions, and Jerrod and I will talk about them the next time we sit down. I can't believe the end of another podcast episode has come. So everybody, again, the show notes will have information for how you can reach Dr. Brown. Again, how you can reach me, living with FASD podcast @gmail.com. If you want to join the community on Facebook, hop on over to Facebook, look in the groups and look up Living with FASD podcast and come on in and join our group. Yeah, if you are interested, if you're a professional listening to this podcast and you want someone to train you, or train your agency or your community organization, you can use the link in the show notes to get that scheduled. And like Dr. Brown says, he does a ton of trainings, so you can always reach out to him with a question about whether or not he'd be available to train your organization. But yeah, so come back next Monday for another candid conversation with someone else, and we'll be sitting down in another 6 weeks with Dr. Brown for part 2 of this. So send us your questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.